That's right. Light is bright. Hi, everybody. Hey, thank you for being so timely. Cheers to you, whatever it is that you're sipping on. Let me know in the comments. Y'all know how I like to know. And I get my tea ideas from all of you. So, what are you sipping on? Where are you tuning in from? And we'll get into trauma responses in a bit. Hi, Muffin. Hello, hello. This light is really bugging me. I'm gonna move. Hey. Hola. Brown Face TV. Cool name. Where are you tuning in from? Hi, June. Thank you for those preliminary likes. I appreciate that. Hi. Where are you tuning in from? What are you sipping on? Let me know. Hi, Dr. B. I'm just having some water in Dallas. I love it. I love it. I actually just got done with my water, so I got to re-up over here. Brooklyn, Arizona. Yes. I love it when we we have a US split there. So Brooklyn right now, we're like in the New York metro, we're like in the 60s. And then Arizona, my assumption is that given the heat wave that's kind of like making its way over there, that all of you are like somewhere like in the 90s and hundreds, which I'm really jealous of because I love heat. So New York City water, yeah, some water drinkers over here. Maybe we'll have like a live that's very water centered. I have some things to say about water and mood that I think might be of interest to some of y'all. As you know, I'm a holistic psychologist, and so a lot of the reflections of like mental health that I like to offer here on social and like really everywhere where I engage with folks is holistic, which of course includes the ways in which we nourish our bodies and how that then nourishes our brain and our minds. I love these lives. Thank you so much for having them weekly. Thank you for being here. They've been so helpful. I'm glad. I'm happy to hear it. Alrighty, y'all. Without further ado, let's get into trauma responses. I have a lot to say about trauma responses. There's so many variations of what we can cover in reference to this topic. And oh, I see chamomile tea. I got a little distracted. Chamomile in Queens. I love it. Chamomile in Queens. Detroit, sipping on some water. Nice. Yeah, so trauma responses are very vast and wide. So what I want to do here is more so like allow us to have a conversation really about the categories of trauma responses so that you're well versed in what categories there are. And then when trauma responses come along, you can always like place them in a category. You can be like, oh, that's that kind of trauma response. That's what's happening. And the reason why I like to frame it this way is because if I were to actually relay all the trauma responses that there are, I'd probably be here forever. Because in reality, there are as many trauma responses as there are people. We as people can become so creative and so crafty as to how we engage in a trauma response. But in reality, it's not all that unique. It's just that we have created a unique way of reflecting, representing a trauma response that many other people have. So I'll stop being so cryptic about it and kind of get to it. So we have trauma responses that are very psychologically centered. We'll say that we'll have the category of psychology-based, like traumatic defenses. We'll have the body-based trauma defenses, that being another category. And then we'll have the relational trauma defenses, which is like how you show up in relationship in reference to having undergone trauma. So we'll have the psychology realm, the body-based realm, and then the relational realm. That's how I like to break it down because I think it's easy for me to digest as a clinician. I think it's easy for other people to digest whenever they're internalizing this knowledge and like really like taking it in. So if you feel me, shoot me a like, let me know, thumbs up. I like to feel a little bit more like I'm in community here, so I don't like the talking to all that much, even though this is a live. I like to see that y'all are like, yes, I'm with it. Ooh, I throw a little apple cider vinegar in my tea because I'm detoxing, so it's a little spicy. Thank you for those thumbs up. So the green heart, the psychological category of trauma responses are more of the trauma responses that we tend to know in the clinical world as what we see like in our diagnostic manual. That's most of what we see when we're talking about trauma responses, especially olden age like clinicians that weren't really attending to the body or to the ways in which relationally we tend to relate to others in reference to our traumas. We're more so going down a bulleted list of the things that were trauma responses and just going off of that. And some of what tends to be like really prominent for people that are suffering with trauma is that they tend to have like very specific experiences around emotion, right? The biggest emotions tend to be like ongoing confusion, anger, there's fear, which cousin of anxiety, right? So anxiety can also be it. There's guilt that people experience. There's the cousin of guilt, which is shame. And sometimes there's depression, right? So all of those can be parts of the emotional experiences inside of trauma. And so how does it show up as a trauma response? It can be that a person feels chronically sad or chronically lonely. These are like more along the lines of what depressive symptoms are. But what is the difference between it being a trauma response and it being depression? The difference is that this person is experiencing the sadness, is experiencing the exhaustion, is experiencing the feeling of despair, the chronic emptiness, the chronic loneliness as a result of something that happened. It's not just purely a biological thing like depression sometimes is, or it's not simply that they're sad or they have like some sort of imbalance in specific hormones inside of the body. It's that an event happened, that event produced a chronic experience of sadness, of emptiness and loneliness. And so we can map it right back to a traumatic event. And so that's where we start understanding, okay, this is a trauma response because it's in response to what happened. Does that make sense? Thumbs up, green hearts. Let me know. Now, these are some of the emotional experiences, right? But then we have other kinds of experiences that also fall under the category of psychology. We have experiences that are usually seen when a person is sleeping. And that means that a person is having nightmares, sleep terrors, difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep. There's a variation of all of these things, or it can just be one. It can be different, like different gradations of it, meaning that it can be like just really low level like nightmares that don't necessarily disrupt a person's sleep too much or make them feel too uneasy. And it can be like the type of nightmares where a person's like, I'm not going to sleep. You cannot tell me I'm going to sleep. I refuse. And it's like, it's just so terrifying that a person literally does not want to close their eyes. And so it can be gradations. It can be like, on one end of the spectrum versus the other. So that's also in the psychological realm. There's also, when a person is awake, difficulties with things that kind of mirror ADHD, like difficulty concentrating, not having a capacity to really focus, right? Being very forgetful, not feeling like they could be present, dissociating. All of those things are also under the category of psychology. However, They're not emotions, and they're not when a person is sleeping. They're awake, but it is almost as if they have a disconnection from their mind in some way. And then we have intrusion. So we have intrusive thoughts, we have flashbacks, and we have um, an inability to control one's thought processes. So all of that is a part of like how a person experiences a trauma response, where there's something that is thought centered or thought related, and it feels really uncomfortable for the person in some way or another. Thank you for those hearts. Woo, that was a mouthful, y'all. Are y'all doing all right? um, Let me know. Shoot me those likes. So that's all of that. So we have the psychological realm, and we have all of those categories of how a person can psychologically emit a trauma response. Now, when we're looking at somebody, like let's say if somebody's coming in into a therapy session and the therapist is like doing a psychological evaluation, they're trying to get a sense of, okay, or do you have this symptom, this symptom, this symptom, and they're going through the list. More often than not, the therapist has to have a number of these symptoms to then diagnose a person with an actual trauma-based, we call them disorders still, so a trauma-based disorder. What's a trauma-based disorder? Something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, reactive attachment disorder in children, right? It's all of those. Like, we need to have a number of these different symptoms showing up in a person's life for a specific period of time, meaning that the person has to have had these symptoms for a period typically of about 30 days or more in order to be considered an actual trauma-centered disorder. I hope that helps, like, clarify some of like how we see trauma in the therapeutic space. Okay, so psychology symptoms, got those out of the way. There's a lot of them, and people have like gradations. Remember, like some people can have like low level sadness, some people can have high level sadness that can be disruptive in their lives in many, many ways, both of which can be trauma responses, just that one person just has like, just a lower grade of it. Now we have the body-based trauma responses. So when we are in a state of trauma, our bodies are registering it at every point in time when the trauma is happening and thereafter. What tends to happen is that whatever we're experiencing in our bodies when the trauma is happening, our bodies tend to become a little bit frozen in that state. And then the body starts having the very same experience over and over again, which means that if when the trauma was happening, you were having like heart palpitations and your heart was beating like a mile a minute, like you were like running a marathon, then it's very, very, very likely that when you're presented with a trauma trigger, like something in your environment reminds you of the traumatic event itself, that your heart is going to start doing the very same thing. It's going to start beating a mile a minute, almost as if it were happening again. If you're the person that had sweaty palms whenever the event was happening, it's very likely that you're going to have sweaty palms. It's very likely you're going to get tension headaches, or that you're going to get sore muscles, or that your breathing is going to get really shallow. All of these experiences are going to start replicating themselves because that's the trauma response, right? You're in a state of trauma, you're experiencing a specific bodily change. And when you're in a trigger response that you're reminded of the trauma, your body goes right back to the very same kinds of responses that it had when the original event happened. That's body. And body is also very versatile. It can be as versatile as there are people. Some people get like a twitch in their eye, right? And that can be something. Some people, start shimmy shaking, right? Like just like trembling in fear. And that's the trauma response that's body centered. It can be very variable. But what we do know is that it typically is connected to some sort of a trigger. Body. And then we have the relational realm. Most often than not, people start to suffer in their relationships when they're experiencing trauma, which I think is like one of the most unfortunate experiences that people tend to have, because it's almost like they feel already really lonely and really feeling like the experience that they're having is distressing enough that they have to have these nightmares or this chronic sadness, or that they have to tremble whenever they, have a specific, like, when they smell a specific smell. And then on top of all of that, then they have relationships that don't necessarily understand that all of these things are happening. And as a result, the relationships tend to crumble. And what it does is that it just feeds a cycle. Because if you can imagine somebody that feels chronically lonely because they're having the experience of trauma, and now in their relationships, they're feeling lonely because they're feeling misunderstood around their trauma, it just feeds that cycle. Eye-opening. Good to hear. Really good to hear. So yeah, so then we have a cycle, and we have a lot of cycles that tend to just come up and stick around as a result of trauma being present in relationships. One of the other trauma responses that are really prominent in relationships are when people lose hope in their capacity to feel safe, connected, and loved in relationships. Losing hope, meaning feeling hopeless about you being able to feel healed, being able to engage in relationships in a healthy way, being able to feel like you can be loved, you can be understood. All of those tend to be experiences that coincide with relationships after trauma. There's also the experience of feeling distant. If you already feel lonely and you feel like you're misunderstood and like that person doesn't get you, and that whenever they're coming around, most often than not, what you're going to feel is some sort of invalidation around your experiences of trauma. People, what you're going to do, what anybody would probably do, is that they're going to start detaching, not wanting to engage, disconnecting, right? Disengaging, even dissociating in the relationship. And so all of that distance tends to be really prominent in the relationship. So a person starts losing their motivation to try and connect, to try and love and feel loved, to try and give any kind of like energy to the relationship, because they feel like they're chronically misunderstood and like their relationship is just feeding a cycle that is making them feel unwell. So there's all of that. And again, like I said with the last one, it starts becoming cyclical. Also, being unable to like really trust. That's a big thing for a lot of people, that especially if you've had any kind of relational trauma. Like, it's not, like, for example, a pandemic is something that has caused us a lot of trauma globally, right? We've all experienced some element of trauma. For some people, it's been a little bit heavier than others. However, the fact that a pandemic has happened creates more so like experiences around like the psychological trauma responses and the body responses, and not as much of the relational piece, except for us introverts, because some of us are like, I can't be social anymore, I don't want to be out in the world. And so there's a little bit of that, right? But for the most part, the relationship like category hasn't been as like profoundly impacted for a lot of people. However, when you are experiencing trauma as a result of being in a relationship that has traumatized you, like if you were in a toxic relationship or in a relationship with somebody that presented with toxic narcissism or psychopathic narcissism, then it makes it so that the experiences that you have around specific relational things that in relationships are really critical, like trust, like basic trust, then your capacity to be able to rely upon another person in a wholehearted way, that's going to be profoundly compromised. So you're very likely to not feel like you can trust not just that person, but it starts becoming very global and generalized to like literally everybody in your life. And so people that are in relationships that have traumatized them tend to then experience trauma responses that make them disengage, disconnect, and distrust of usually a lot of the people in their lives, not just the perpetrator of their hurt. Does that make sense? Let's see. I feel like that now because it's been 8 years since my last relationship, which was abusive after being single. Yeah. Yes, with everyone. Yeah. I hear that. So that's the thing about trauma, is that it basically like disrupts your capacity to discern, who is a person that can hurt you versus who is a person that will not. I mean, everybody will disappoint us in some way or another in life, right? But the thing about trauma that is suffered in relationship to other people is that it basically makes you so hyper vigilant of the possibility of being hurt like that again, that it makes it so that your radar is kind of like, let's say, like temporarily broken. And as a result, what happens is that you're like, can I trust? I don't even know. Like, can I trust them? I don't know. Right. So that there's a lot of confusion that happens for people that are coming out of these toxic relationships. They feel like the best thing that they could do for themselves is enclose themselves, withdraw from the social world. And that way they don't have to sit here and like be in that ball of confusion around whether or not they could trust somebody. But the thing is that really that trust meter has been like destroyed, even if temporarily, until they can rebuild that trust. But it can be really tricky to be um, in a position where you're getting out of or have gotten out of traumatic relationships, and you're trying to get yourself into trusting someone again. That's why whenever I work with folks around the trust element of trauma responses, I'm usually working with them on how to trust themselves first. So we're working with that part of trust, self trust, because that's disrupted too. And then we get into the trusting others piece. Whenever we have gotten a good handle on the self trust piece, then we transition over. But I don't start with others, automatically, because that can be actually really disruptive, and it can actually be even re-traumatizing for some folks. So I think starting with how you can trust yourself is always a safe bet for me as a clinician, and even in the work that I've done myself, just as a person, as a human. Self trust. um you know so I'll explain. Someone's saying, like, Joanna, you're saying like self trust, what does it mean? Really, people tend to lose their ability to trust that they can make sound decisions, for example. um that's a big one, right? So let's just stay there. If I can't trust that I can make sound decisions, that's my self trust being disrupted. However, it's in part because I have lost trust in my capacity to make good decisions, because I believe that I made a bad decision in choosing that person as a partner, and look how they turned out. That's the narrative, right? People start basically saying, like, I can't even trust myself. I don't even know. I'm so confused. Like, can I really make a good decision? Can I really like um make a good decision even about a friendship? Like, can I say that this is potentially a good friend? I don't know. I don't trust myself to choose good people around me anymore. And so being able to trust yourself to make good decisions has to come gradually, and it has to start with small things. Believe it or not, for some people, it even has to start as small as like, being able to choose the right items in a grocery store, and trust yourself that you can choose the right things for your refrigerator. I kid you not, like it even gets to that granular level. Like, and then we build it up. And then you start trusting yourself with bigger things. And then you start trusting yourself with small things again, but in relationship. And then you start trusting yourself with medium things in relationship. And then trusting yourself with bigger things. And what I mean by like small things, like, for example, maybe you don't trust that, somebody will show up for you and like be kind to you, right? What you can do is that you can start trusting that a person might just um let's say that you exchange numbers with somebody, but you don't trust that they're going to call, right? We start small. We start with just trusting that they're going to text, and then trusting, like, we just like build it up, right? But that's the thing, is that the self-trust piece has to come first, and then we have to start working on the other person. My examples today are not on point, but I think y'all get what I mean. Like, you have to first, we do the self-trust piece, then we do the other people trust piece, and we do it in layer in actual like levels. So we do it with small, and then we kind of work our way up. Build my confidence in my decision making. Yeah, that's super important. With the small stuff, like the small stuff counts too, y'all. So we can't discount them. If anybody has any like additional questions, definitely pop them in because I'm almost done with this piece and I want to make sure that we transition into questions because I always leave like 5 or so minutes for questions and then I'm like, oops. um, and the other thing that I wanted to talk about was like just feeling on guard. I kind of hinted at this a little bit in mentioning like how, people when they exit these relationships, they can be a bit hyper vigilant, like too vigilant of the possibilities of being hurt again. And so that's kind of like where their mind stays. And so as a result, what tends to happen is that more often than not, they think this person's going to mess up and hurt me in the same ways that the other one did. So a lot of what tends to happen in these kinds of experiences is that people start self-sabotaging. And then self-sabotage becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you start self-sabotaging, you start doing things to like, trigger the other person to be mean to you. And then what happens? They prove you right. And so it feeds that narrative that you now have in your head that people are mean, people are bad, people are toxic, and they're going to be bad to you. Yeah, so any questions you might have, please pop them in. Let's see. This is great. Thank you for saying so. Or they do call you and you go ghost because you don't trust. Yeah. You don't trust that you made the good decision in giving them your number in the first place. It's all self-fulfilling prophecy. It leads to self-sabotage. Then it leads to that corroborating the initial idea that you had that people are toxic and they're not to be trusted. So it just becomes really cyclical. How can you trust your ex with the kids after a toxic relationship? So trust them in like trust that they would take care of their own children. I'm wondering if that's what you mean, like Heidi, if there's the possibility that they may take care of their own children and you can trust them to do so, or if not. Now let's think about this, like because toxic relationships, they don't necessarily always translate into toxic parenting. Some people can actually have really solid parenting while also being supremely hurtful and damaging to fellow adults. So that's something that we can consider, right? Like that I think, of course, as a parent, you're going to have the fear of like, what if this person could hurt my kids, the people I love, right? And that's a very valid fear. However, I think that what I would want to do with someone as an initial, like the initial thing that I would want us to at least contemplate them and then think about would be like whether or not you've seen this person err in their parenting or be a toxic parent. And in that case, if there is no danger to the children, and it's just that this person maybe like says certain things that are, off-putting and can be in the long term damaging to the kids once they're adults because they've internalized like certain things that they've said, I would even want to work with the kids, especially as a therapist. I would want to work with the kids to try and see how the kids are internalizing what they're seeing, what they're hearing, and then work with the parents to try and make sure that, yeah. I'm trying to be cautious here because this is like tricky territory, but I think that it would be important to work with the kids to make sure that they're not internalizing whatever toxicity they're witnessing. Yes, exactly. I kept asking my tia if she was really coming for dinner over and over because I have so much mistrust and fear. That's a really good example. And I'm really sorry that, the fear was like so prominent in you that you didn't trust that someone would actually show up for you. That was actually the example that I was going to give, but I didn't want to give it for a reason. However, I think that that's one thing, especially when it comes to abandonment trauma, that people tend to experience a lot, where if they've been abandoned early in life, especially, the narrative is like, nobody's going to show up. They're not going to show up. And so, yeah, if you have dinner with somebody, you're probably that friend that's like constantly like, are you here? Are you here? Are you here? And that's coming from a place of abandonment trauma and abandonment fears rather than you really wondering if the person is like 2 minutes away. Now, of course, the question that I'm probably going to get asked, and the question that a lot of people want to know is like, okay, so, what do I do with that? Well, the very first thing that we have to do is to identify what the trauma response is. When people know what their trauma responses are, there's already a baseline of self empowerment and self awareness that can be incredibly helpful for people, that can't be underestimated. So that's something that's, I think that people are like, oftentimes like, okay, now I have this knowledge. What do I do with it? What you do with it is that you constantly remind yourself of the fact that that is what is actually happening. Because think about it, there are two ways of functioning. One way is you're operating in the trauma response and you're just in fear and you're not aware of what is happening or why it's happening. And it's just producing more and more fear. It's escalating and you're feeling gravely overwhelmed. The other thing that can happen is that you're in your trauma response, you're in the fear response as well. And now you're saying, that's fear. That's that trauma response. That falls under the category of the psychological responses to trauma. I know what this is. It's coming from my abandonment trauma. It's because, my mother like left when I was 8 years old and she never came back. And I believe that other people aren't going to come back. That's what's happening in this moment, right here and right now, as I'm sitting in this restaurant waiting for my friend. It's not that there's something that's happening in the transaction between my friend and I. It's that I'm sitting in my trauma response and that it's bringing me back into my past rather than allowing me to be present in my present life right now. That, especially in comparison to the other one, is such an empowering place to be. And it's even more empowering, I kid you not, when we can enter a point of vulnerability, especially if we feel like the person that is with us is safe, and we can say, you know what? I just had a trauma response. This is what happened to me. And when we can exercise that, when we can actually say what's happening, it has been like literally shown to help us to diminish the impact of what is happening. It diminishes the actual trigger response. It diminishes the emotions that are overtaking us when we can say, that's what's happening. That's what it is. It's very empowering. So what do you do with it? You utilize it in order to understand what is happening to you at every given moment. So you increase your own self-awareness, and that in and of itself is empowering. It's not the only thing that we do. There's so many other things that we do thereafter. But the initial thing that we do is that we gain a level of self-awareness, and that self-awareness can in and of itself be healing. I hope that makes sense, y'all. Y'all know I be getting, if you like been on these lives, I get heady and I get excited and nerd out, but yeah. Okay, I see a question. He used to do the silent treatment all the time. Is that a form of abandonment? It is. It is, because stonewalling or the silent treatment, kind of the same thing, sort of. They both are psychological abandonment. So there is the physical abandonment, like somebody left, they never came back, a divorce, right? Logistical, physical abandonment. And then there is a psychological abandonment, like you being left on red, you being ghosted, you being given the silent treatment, you being stonewalled. Those are psychological versions of abandonment. And they're temporary abandonments versus the long-term abandonment, of like somebody leaving, and just never coming back. However, we have to remember that when it comes to triggers, present day triggers, our minds have a tough time distinguishing what is in the present and what is in the past. It's just gonna like create this mumble jumble, like mess of emotions that all feel like the same thing. So the experience that you had around being abandoned early in life is going to feel very much the same like the feeling of being psychologically abandoned yesterday. So it is a form of abandonment, just a different category of it. But yeah, it's a great question. Great question. I love it. Any other thoughts? Any other questions that people might have? Thanks. Got it now. I understand what you mean by abandonment trauma. So helpful. You're so welcome. I'm glad that that's helpful. Yeah, the same goes with loss. Whenever we experience loss, it can become really complicated. That's why we have what we call complicated grief. And what that means is that, let's say, the shed in your house burned when you were 10 years old, and all of your favorite toys were in there. You lost everything. To you, it meant everything. That was everything. The rest of the house didn't quite matter. Everything was in that shed with all those toys. That was your life. You're a 10-year-old. That's all you care about. Now you lose a pencil, and all of a sudden it feels like your whole world is flipped upside down. You're like, where's my pencil? When in reality, a lot of what's happening is that mosh posh of like emotions that are now like mixing up together, the past and the present, and you're feeling the intensity. That's the trauma response. You feel the intensity of those emotions. But in reality, had you not had that history of having that shed burned down with all your toys in the past, losing a pencil would be so different for you. It would feel so different. It would just be another pencil loss versus I lost a pencil. My whole life is a mess right now. That's the thing about these triggers, and trauma responses are how we respond to a trigger. It's that we feel like we're back in a moment that causes deep despair and deep distress. And it almost feels as though we cannot differentiate between the two. So, hoping that's enlightening. Maybe I'll take one more question before we end. And then I will go sip some water like the rest of y'all hydrated folks. Yeah, someone holds me. That's on me. Speaking of, I think maybe I should probably cover on these lives love languages. I don't know what y'all think about that, but I think there's so much to say about love languages and emotions. So I want to get into that with some of y'all. Okay, so it seems like unless there's a lag here, like we are fresh out of questions for this topic. However, I'm thinking that I'm going to be covering a little bit more about this because I feel like something else is going to come to mind. So I'm going to record a few videos so that I can have something for y'all to work with in reference to trauma responses. But I really hope that this was enlightening. Remember that these lives are saved on my YouTube channel. Subscribe and, hit the bell so you can get pinged whenever we go live. And, just come back to the live if you feel like you want to get some more information that maybe you didn't gather the first time around. Yes, let's get into love languages. Okay. I love the confirmation. Thank you, y'all, for that. Love languages it is. We shall. I mix it should and shall. We shall be covering those very, very soon so that we can, it's cuffing season. So we may need to cover that very, very soon. But yeah, so that we can have that language and that we can have that language tied to emotions. We can have that language tied to trauma or emotional experiences that have been hurtful. We can tie that language to breakups. Just want to make sure that it's very comprehensive, like the way that we cover it. So I will be sure to bring in love languages as a topic in a future live. So look out for that. Subscribe, hit the bell. I'll let you know when that's dropping, and you'll get notified when it is. And not cuffing season. Y'all know it's cuffing season. Y'all know we got to start covering these relationship stuff because it's going to save you a lot of grief come spring. So yeah, we'll definitely be covering some of that. But thank you for tuning in. It's been wonderful vibing with y'all. And, come back next week, same time, same place, and we'll cover another topic that hopefully, will enlighten you and make your life a little bit easier. But thank you for tuning in. I appreciate y'all. Take care, everybody.